This is my first time using pastel pencils. Will they be a new favorite or a total fail? I've spent years mastering colored pencils. I know exactly how they blend, layer, and behave, but pastel pencils, that's a whole different story. Aside from some mixed media tinkering, I've never actually used them as my main medium for a piece. That changes today, and I am not easing into it. With a full set of 60 Faber-Castell Pitt pastel pencils and a large sheet of pastel mat, I'm diving into a big project and I'm taking you along for the ride. Along the way, I'll share how they compare to colored pencils, my favorite and least favorite things about them, and some useful tips. But with all the surprises I ran into, will I end up loving pastel pencils or never wanting to use them again? Let's find out. I started this piece by carefully selecting the color of pastel mat that I would use. I selected this light green shade because I felt like the colors were really going to complement each other. I have an upcoming video that is completely dedicated to picking the color of your paper, specifically pastel mat. And if that is of interest to you, make sure that you are subscribed and that you turn your notifications on so that you are notified right when that video drops. I started off with a sketch of my subject using one of the brown pastel pencils. And I prioritized composition at first, making sure that everything was in the right spot. And then I began to add more detail and more pressure as I became more and more confident with my sketch. These pastel pencils can slide around a lot and be easily erased on slicker paper, but on a textured surface like pastel mat, they're going to be a little bit more permanent. So if you do want some flexibility in your sketch and you want to be able to smudge and erase, you might choose to draw on a separate sheet of paper and then transfer it over later. I wanted to play with a material that I was familiar with, and I wanted to get a significant amount of color onto my surface fast. As per usual, I like to establish my darks and my shadows early on, and Pan Pastels allows me to do that really quickly. I am using the full set of 80 Pan Pastels and a few different sponge applicators from Soft Tools. I love this combination, and I love putting in a quick layer of Pan Pastels first because it helps me understand the color relationships before I come in with fine details and with texture. And this is a technique that I've used with colored pencils before. I found this to be a very helpful technique with pastel pencils, but you don't have to have the underpainting to use them. I have used them without this underpainting as well since filming this video, and they're a great option on their own as well, although they can take just a little bit longer to fill in the tooth of the paper or to cover the color of the paper underneath. As I previously mentioned, I've used this Pan Pastel underpainting on pastel mat for colored pencil drawings. In fact, this is my go-to method for drawing fur, either in animal portraits or wildlife. I'm used to the way that colored pencil feels in this scenario. They're precise, they offer fine details, and I feel like you can just layer them over and over again. But with pastel pencils, it felt different right away, and I wanted to reach for my colored pencils so bad. But if I did, I was never gonna learn how these pastel pencils worked and what their pros and cons were. So I kept chugging away. With pastel pencils, I couldn't use as much pressure as I was used to using with my colored pencils. I also felt like I couldn't layer quite as much. The pastel pencils were laying down more material, which was filling up the paper faster. But after some time, I realized that I didn't actually need to layer as much. This opaque medium didn't need layer after layer after layer like colored pencils did. I could lay down quite a bit of color with each stroke, and then I could soften and adjust my color by blending with my finger or with a blending tool. This allowed me to fill in gaps that would normally have taken a lot longer to fill in with colored pencil. And unlike colored pencil that were quite separate from the underpainting, the pastel pencils became more integrated into the underpainting. Both mediums were pastels, so I could blend them into one another and use the underpainting to affect the color that I was applying with my pastel pencil. I also found that it wasn't going to be as necessary to cover every part of the underpainting. In some places, I left it alone or just tweaked it slightly, and this was pretty different from the way that I use them with colored pencils where I almost covered everything except for the background. On this piece, I have several different textures. The fur on the tiger is different than the fur on the sloth, and the sloth's face has a few different textures as well. So I'm really trying to figure out how to make these textures look different, and pencils in general are really good for rendering textures because they've got a sharp point as compared to like a brush where you're learning how to manipulate the brush to create different textures. But pastel pencils are definitely the best tool I've ever used in rendering textures quickly and effectively. I was able to make subtle changes to the way I was using the pencil and get that light, short fur texture in the snout and make it look dramatically different than the ratty fur throughout the body of the sloth. And I say ratty with so much love. This is a stuffy that has been used and very much loved by my children. As I worked on rendering these textures, I tried several different techniques, and the technique I found that worked the best for me was overemphasizing the texture. So I really looked closely at my reference photo. I paid attention to where the shadows were and what the marks in that area were doing, and then I drew them very literally. Then I would soften them with future layers of colored pencils, usually a lighter color over the top, and then blending and smudging with my pencil. One of my favorite colored pencil techniques is glazing. This is laying a thin transparent layer of color over an area to help unify it. And I was so excited that this technique worked with pastel pencils. Here I am using a light layer of gray to unify the fur on the left side of the face. And this really helped me get all those different brush strokes that I was overemphasizing to work together.
Yep.
As I worked on the sloth, there was definitely a lot of trial and error figuring out how to get this light brown fur rendered and make the texture feel kind of matted. I played around with several different techniques, and then once I found something that worked, I just copied and pasted throughout the rest of the sloth. I wanted to make it feel really consistent. And what ended up working best for me was mapping in the darks, then coming over and establishing the texture with one of the lighter colors, not white, but a light gray or a peachy tone, and then finding those mid-value colors to soften up the texture. Then coming in and emphasizing some of the texture, some of the shadows that are formed by little chunks of hair folding over with some of those dark and mid-value range colors again. Now, I didn't do a colored pencil sloth right next to it, so I can't measure exact, but I would estimate that this pastel pencil version probably went 5 or 6 times faster than the colored pencil version would have. I didn't have to build up individual hairs the same way. I could scribble things in, smudge them with my pencil, come over again with another layer. I could work light on top of dark, dark on top of light. It was very, very flexible, and easing off of the expectation that I get every little bit right actually helped the fur feel more realistic. Because I'm an art educator and I have this YouTube channel, when I try out a new product, I really like to try out the full range of colors so that I can speak to the product as a whole. And when I looked for the largest set of pastel pencils available by Faber-Castell, the largest set was only 60, and this made me a little bit nervous. For whatever reason, I thought that I was going to need more pastel pencils than I would colored pencils because I thought they were going to be harder to mix, and that just wasn't true. I actually could have done this tiger with far fewer pastel pencils than the ones I was working with. I could have had all the colors I needed in the 24 or the 30 set, and I did like having some of those more neutral colors available as I was working on the sloth. I think that the 60 set really benefited that. But depending on what you're drawing, you might not need a huge set of pastel pencils to get started because they are a softer material and not nearly as permanent as colored pencils. I can easily blend them with my finger and create new colors. I've always enjoyed giving myself artistic challenges, and one of my favorites is working with a limited color palette. When you know how to work with a limited color palette, you're going to be able to get the most out of your colors even when you expand into larger color palettes. I have a really fun, intuitive color theory project that is linked in the video description. It's a great way to test out a limited palette and learn how to mix colors by playing and experimenting. This project was so fun, and it allowed me to discover some really exciting things about pastel pencils. I loved how fast they moved, and I loved that I was able to mix the colors and to even pull in some of my glazing techniques that I usually use with colored pencils. But do I love pastel pencils enough to trade all of my colored pencils in? No, I still love my colored pencils too. Colored pencils are a great way for establishing depth through layers of color and creating that really vibrant luminosity. I haven't been able to get that same play of light with pastel pencils yet, but I will definitely use pastel pencils when I want to render fur, create a quick study, or to play around with some new techniques. I also love pastel pencils for going a little bit larger. This was a really fun piece to complete, and I have never done a piece this large so fast. If you've tried pastel pencils before, I would love to hear about your experience down in the comments section. And if you're on the fence and think that you might be interested in trying out these new supplies, feel free to ask me any questions. I would love to help you figure out if this is the right art supply for you. Remember that pan pastel underpainting that I created at the beginning of this piece? I also brought pan pastel in to help me with the background, and that allowed me to fill in spaces and get a sense for color really quickly. If you're ready to dive in and learn more about pan pastels, make sure to watch this video next.